And thank you to all of you who are here. This is Saeed Mirza's third day with us in Bangalore. We had screenings of his film the day before, Salim Langde Pe Matro, and we had Naseem. If you haven't seen his movies, I would suggest that you go and have a look at some of them on YouTube. So he's been known as a filmmaker for most of his life. He began writing long form about 15 or 16 years ago. I'd like to begin by asking him why he turned to that medium, and did he find the same levels of satisfaction in it as he did with the film?
I switched from one medium to another primarily because I needed to. There's a word in Hindi, apne aap ko sametna. How do you gather yourself? And I needed to get to literature or to books primarily because I felt that the way I see and I could not be able to contain my entire experience in the form of a film, and I needed to find another outlet to be able to contain the thoughts that were going through my mind. And therefore I chose the path of writing. And I chose it in a sense primarily because I felt that here I have the opportunity of combining various kinds of forms. For instance, you have the narrative, and then you can also have soliloquies, you can have interior monologues, you can have history being tossed in, and you can have documentation coming through. So you're mixing these forms in a book, and I've never called my books novels because I have a problem with the idea of a novel because I feel that by and large, even as a form, it is outdated as a form, the novel. When I say this, is when novels turn descriptive in terms of writing, one image is enough to convey much more in terms of a photograph. So if novels have to go beyond the given structure of the linear pattern, how do you proceed further? And that was my attempt to create a kind of form which combines literature, hopefully, in some form or the other, but also to be able to convey ideas and to be able to convey the kind of, I'm trying to convey an idea to you all. I believe that if one tries to reflect upon the world that we've experienced, it doesn't come in the form of linearity. It comes in all kinds of shapes and forms of images, past, it mixes up the past, the present, the future, it goes into documentary, it goes into images, it comes back into a narrative. And that's the form that I try to create through my books. So I moved to literature primarily because I was dissatisfied by the structure of films, and I could therefore experiment with the novel.
Not too many people have both made films and have written long form. What is it that you felt you were able to express better in writing, and what is it that you felt you were not able to vis-a-vis films?
Like I said earlier, to contain. What is the, how do you contain an idea? How do you contain a thought process? Through films and through a novel. And what is the difference between the two? I think the novel gives you far more freedom of experimentation. And you can play with all kinds of forms and shapes. For instance, my first book was, I called it a literary installation. I was using the kind of, an art form of, say, painting. But I called my books a kind of a literary installation. I can use the narrative, documentary, history, soliloquies, interior monologues, and hopefully try to see if they can be put together in a kind of shape and form which can be cohesive. I'm not so sure whether I succeeded, but the attempt was there to be able to create a form that would be able to convey to the reader all kinds of ideas simultaneously, which includes maybe a storyline.
One last theoretical question. Did you find as much satisfaction at the end of your novel as you did maybe with some of your films?
In fact, much more. Primarily because I didn't know where I was landing.
Sorry, you did not know where you were.
I did not know where I was landing. And therefore, the entire journey was a kind of an experiment.
These are not fully formed books in your head that you're just typing out.
Absolutely. It's not fully formed in my head. And as it proceeds, you're creating again and again and again. So therefore, it's not, and that satisfaction that you get is it's like an adventure. You're on an adventure and you don't know where you're going to land. And you realize, okay, where do I end, say, a narrative and go into a soliloquy? Does it work? And from a soliloquy, do I go into interior monologue and then do I go into history? And therefore, that's what I'm trying to say is that when you imagine these thought processes that go through your mind and try to bring them down into a novel, it's an incredible adventure.
The first book, Ammi, this is a woman, your mother, who's not particularly well-read. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely.
And this book is written around the time when you made your last film, Amik to Chance, as well. So you're in a period where you're fairly active and you have the avenues to be able to express yourself outside of writing as well. What made you want to write this book? Why this subject and why this form?
It was to pay your salams in retrospect. But in paying your salams to a person you were very close to, simultaneously, you could also use that journey of paying your salams, but also then recreating a history through that simultaneously. You're paying your salams because that gives you the novel, a book, a spine. But you're also simultaneously conveying an entire history along with it. And then, after having done that, then from there you can actually, from the open letter that you're writing, you can then move into politics, into history, into interior monologue, into a diatribe, then come back to the letter, because it was, like I said, paying your salams and your it's like unburdening yourself. Unburdening yourself. And the entire process of unburdening it is an incredible adventure. For those of you who've read the book, I wonder, the book is called Ammi, a Letter to a Democratic Mother. I'm not suggesting that it's a great book, but I do believe it's a book, the kind of structure, it's a kind of book which is quite unique in its form and structure. Because here I was taking on the idea of a novel. Here I was trying to pay my salams to a mother who was, as he said earlier, who in quotes was not necessarily well-read, and who was married to a man who happened to be my father, who was incredibly erudite and well-read. And you're paying your salams to them, their relationship, and to history simultaneously. And in that journey, how do you now construct this entire world? And simultaneously, the same lady who in quotes was ill-read or not well-read enough, who had an incredible thirst for information about the world she was living in. The time she spent reading the Urdu newspaper and then talking to my father about things that she'd read. So it gave me an opportunity of now conveying another form of history, of news gathering, to my mother.
And does it reflect in any sense actual conversations that you had?
Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's real and sometimes it's imagined. I play games with both. But fundamentally, it is truthful in that sense, despite the fact that some of this is imagined. But by and large, I think it means the sense of my personal integrity vis-a-vis my relationship with her. You know? So that is what I try to maintain. I mean, how do you explain the fact that here's a lady who talked about, she wanted to know about, you know, the Vietnam War. What did it mean to her? Theoretically, she should not be asking that question, but she did. She wanted to know what it is really about. And now from there, if you expand an idea, then you can very easily jump to the war. She's passed away, but you can always jump to the war in Iraq and what happened over there, and convey an entire situation of the world post her death. But convey that to her now because of her thirst for information about the world she was living in. And because of the fact that she was married to my father, it was somehow she felt a sense of not knowing enough. Not knowing enough. And therefore, the language, another thing was a thirst for the language. She spoke in Urdu and Farsi. And the language of English. Now what happens when you have a mother who's incredibly spirited and incredibly, but she has magic in her hand, she could create things out of, but she feels incredibly insecure at her dining table where all of us sit together, but the conversation is conducted in English because we happen to have been sent deliberately to a school in Mumbai, fairly elite school, where the medium of instruction is English. And then, therefore, how a language over time becomes an instrument for distancing, as opposed to coming together. A language actually starts separating you from people you love, specifically your mother, and you're trying very hard to get back into a relationship, but the language is always there as a barrier. And she tries to bridge that barrier with, Maulvi is coming to teach me Urdu, and it's a debate, it's a battle on for reaching out to hold each other, and it's very, very, very difficult. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. So in fact, she lost the battle. But I say that it's like a journey of like I said, paying my salams, and a journey to say, I'm on your side.
It's totally fascinating, and I wish we had more time to speak about her. But you said that you were deliberately sent to a school that taught you in the English medium. Why was that the case? And could you also tell us a bit about the background growing up? What sort of books, what sort of literature, what sort of movies were played in this house? What sort of music?
For those of you all who were here yesterday, I was incredibly curious as a child, and I turned into an, in quotes, unbeliever at the age of 10. I stopped believing. And but the moment you end up not believing in the idea of a God, it automatically opens up all kinds of questioning processes in your mind. Because the journey to say, I do not believe in prayer, and I do not believe that there is a God, the thought process that goes through a child's mind is fairly different. And it opens up all kinds of questionings in your life. And you end up, because of that, ending up reading books. And then my father was always there. And for instance, I told you the story of suddenly you're exposed to world cinema and you're exposed to world literature. And these are all journeys, and with these journeys, plus there's a school that you are there, and then you're continuously trying to correct your mother's pronunciation of the word school. She could never get it right. It was school, screen. Because you come from a Persian and Urdu tradition, and you're trying to correct her, saying, Ammi, it's school. S-C-S-K-U-L, school. I know, it's school. The point is, it seems trite. now, but it's historical, this little detail. And it's the same lady who wore a burqa all her life, born in a Pathan family, and then decided when they come to Bombay and they see, and her husband, the man she marries, is a flamboyant raconteur, terror of tales, etc. And they see films at Eros and English films at Eros. And then one fine day, it's interval, they're coming back home from, that time they were staying at Kafpur, they're coming back home and she's getting ready to put the burqa on. And he asks her a question. He says, do you really want to put that on, Begum? And she shakes her head. She says, don't put it on. And then they walk from Eros to Kaf Parade. It's the most silent revolution in the world. She stopped wearing the burqa because it's a revolution that's occurred, and she folds it and puts it into a trunk and then never takes it out again. Now, what does it mean? It shows a kind of woman who wants to be, and there's historical circumstances that she's trapped in, and then wants to be outside of that and take a leap into so-called modernity, but the terms are hers. The terms she wants to define are hers. And she defines those terms. So then when she starts speaking English, and we start laughing and say, Mom, she got it wrong. So what if it's wrong? Urdu is a superior language. Angrezi kya hai? It's a superior language. But these are revolutions that are occurring in your life on a dining table. The eating of pork or not eating pork. These are things that are, it's incredible that we can sit, I'm sitting here today, but there were so many upheavals in my life that I was seeing and caused for revolution. Okay, you know, you're in school and you're ashamed of your mother has given you aloo parathas and something else, you know, and the father is saying, want my ham sandwich? So you're, theek hai yaar, lenge. So you exchange your paratha for a ham. Next thing you know, that ham is pork. You never thought. You know, pork is wrong. Ham, you didn't know pork, ham was pork. And you're all of 7 or 8 years old. So you have the ham sandwich, and they say, you've sinned. Your ham is pork. I say, no, it's not. It is not. And a fight occurs. But you're walking back from school to home, and you're saying you've sinned. And my sister, who's elder, says, you've sinned. She's 5 years older than I am. My brother tried to protect me. He said, no, he didn't know it was pork. He thought it was ham. He didn't know ham was pork. But you're walking home. It's the longest walk in your life because you're going home because the journey is that you've sinned, and according to Islam, hell is a terrifying space. You're going to be roasted and toasted till eternity. You're going. That's it. And you don't know how to defend yourself because you're just a journey. And all that occurs actually is, oh, it's okay. Didn't know it. The turmoil in your mind has been stopped, calmed, and you're okay with it.
Because your mom said it was okay.
My father brought up the idea of, ham used to be all Jude, Abrahamic religion had a problem with pork because the pork was whatever thing. But since time, it's been better and meat is taken care of. The scientific explanation. So my mother said, you don't tell him about that. There'll be no pork in my house anyway, but it is a mistake. And then at the end of the dining table, she defines sin. And she says, actually, sin is not whether you eat pork or don't eat pork. Sin is when you sin against people. That is the sin. She has leapt into history. Will my father say that? No. The erudite man? I don't think so. He wouldn't use it. You see it that way. But she saw it that way. If you sin against another, that's a sin.
They both sound like really fascinating people. What made you decide that the book would have to be addressed to her?
Because it resonates with so many revolutions. It resonates with so many historical moments that I think are so critical in my life. It resonates with all of that. It's made me what I am. The idea of saying, do you know what it means to actually believe all men are equal? to actually mean it. And what my mother did with the help in the house, that all men are equal, all men stroke women are equal. What did it mean? It is practiced in my house.
That book has a lot of material that a writer would have actually collected over decades. And some of the stuff in it is part of your own experiences and your travels across India, including one fairly long trip that you took, and it references some of the people there. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip? It'll sort of help us understand what kind of material is in that book.
That was a journey to regain faith. Did any of you all see the last time I made is a film called Naseem? Any of you all saw it yesterday? Yeah, well, that was I sort of nailed the coffin. It was the epitaph for my country, the country that I believed in. I was trying to write an epitaph for it. And that journey was actually a journey to regain faith, because it was to regain faith through the idea of my mother. Because she was what I would call the extraordinarily ordinary woman. And it's strange how the ordinary can become so really extraordinary. And you journey through India, and it was a journey for about 5.5 months, continuously on the road. And we traveled for about 55,000 kilometers, just traveling, avoiding highways and to villages, small town, dhabas, chit-chatting and traveling on. And that was a journey in which you regained faith, because you were in such a state of despair after the demolition of the mosque. And I refuse to call it the disputed structure. The demolition of the mosque. You were in a state of despair because you try to figure out, try to imagine, how does that demolition of a space, a mosque which is perhaps medieval and dilapidated, how does bringing it down restore a country's dignity? I'm trying to figure this out in my head. How does a country's dignity get restored? By bringing down a structure and saying, now and I'm not suggesting that. I'm sure the Muslim people did a lot of temple bashing. I'm absolutely sure of it. A lot of temple bashing was done, but like a lot of Buddhist bashing was done earlier, and a lot of Jain bashing was done earlier. It's the role of history of one conqueror after another. They do a lot of bashing of the other. But how does this restore a nation's dignity? And I'm trying to figure this out. And so therefore, to me, I felt it's like an assault on what my mother stood for. And I decided to travel. And I journeyed.
This is 2 cars and a lot of people.
A lot of cars.
A lot of cars and a lot of people.
Yeah.
And
documenting it.
And this is a material that you use sort of for a TV.
It is called a tryst with the people of India. It is called a tryst with the people of India.
While you were doing this, were you also documenting yourself in a diary or something?
Absolutely.
How does the material?
It's a link between my journey, our journey, and the people we meet on the journey simultaneously, all combined into one. It is called a tryst with the people of India, and we traveled I think 55,000 kilometers continuously. But it restored your faith. It restored your faith in the ordinary.
How?
I know, Aakar, it's like, which I've always been led to believe, the generosity of spirit of the ordinary Indian. The generosity of spirit, of the dhaba owner, the little boys of your tea, a truck driver, a small farmer, a little school teacher somewhere. And they are very generous people. And their attitude towards life and a world was incredibly open. And then you wondered about, if this is so, if this is my country, how do you explain those hordes?
How did you?
I can't. Because this is also my country. I'm not suggesting the hordes are different. They're also my country. But I want to know which country do I belong to now. And I belong to this country. And which gives you faith, which gives you strength, and it gives you dignity. So I belong to this country. But I also know simultaneously there are hordes with a lot of anger, a lot of hate, a lot of, I don't know, violence. It's also true. So is this country schizophrenic? I'm not so sure, but most countries are, I would assume. What country do you choose and fight for?
I don't know of too many books that have material of this power and this directness. Did you feel at the end of writing it, after it had been edited and it was out in physical form, that what you had started out to achieve was more or less achieved by the end of it?
One day I felt exhausted, quite honestly.
A lot of novelists say that.
I felt exhausted because it was an unburdening of 1,000 things. You were unburdening, and you were, but even there's a pleasure in unburdening, but it's also exhausting. Because you are trying to reframe, reimagine your life and a journey through people and through a world, including history, and you are reimagining stories, some real, some imagined, and putting it all together in a form and shape, and not knowing whether it's working. The worst part is, Aakar, is when you're writing a story, it's a story. There's a beginning, the middle, and there's an end. Here you don't know. You don't know whether you achieved anything or achieved something. Good. And I still don't know. I remember I got a response for this book when I was writing my second book. So this gentleman said, Saeed, why are you writing another book? Because you can't write another book. This is it. You should, because this is it, you know. You can't write another book. What will you do with the other book? Because this is done. And what more do you have to say? And it was actually in praise of the book. He said, this is, you can't, it's over. One's got to go and make some film now. But strange response. But yeah.
I don't want to move on from this book, but I have to. So for your next book, which you begin writing almost immediately after the first, okay, so a small digression. Could you very briefly tell us how it is that you write? What is the process as a writer? You've got homes in Bombay, you have another place elsewhere which you used to write. Can you just describe to us very briefly what the process of your writing day is like?
I have a home in Mumbai and I have a home in Goa. I do most of my, but since I've been ill, I've been living in Bombay, but I have a home in Goa, in a little village. But I do most of my writing over there. Basically, the process is you get up in the morning, you start writing from 10 in the morning, you take a break at lunchtime, then you have a little nap in the afternoon, continue writing till about 6:30, and then you stop, close shop, go across to the bar, have a drink, you know. But the thing is, it's a routine in a sense, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, sometimes you end up saying, you know, is Goa the place to write? I'm not so sure. Why do I reject Bombay as a space to write? I don't quite know. But I somehow find I get a little more, I feel a little more calm in Goa so that I can collect my thoughts and be able to write. But then sometimes I also feel that sheer grit of that city is also required to be able to write. So I think I spend more time in Goa writing, but a little less time in Bombay when I write.
Okay, so a second work where you have a more global view on the way things are. This is also at a time, well, the first book was also at the same time, but this happens at a time when the primary global story becomes 9/11, terrorism, Islam. A lot of people write about the idea of how that is projected in good and bad terms. You choose to write a book, another novel, which takes into account, once again, just as the first book, actual things, and you're trying to relate material from history and trying to make it relevant to the time. Can you tell us why you chose that subject, and a little bit more about the book?
No, it was called The Monk, the Moa, and Moses Ben Jaloon. It's a narrative it's in defense of an Islam, that was incredibly erudite and poetic, a kind of a renaissance that existed. Because it was a civilization that borrowed from all earlier civilizations and enriched itself through astronomy, music, architecture, history, philosophy, mathematics, music. It was an age of 700 years, of about from the 7th century to the 14th century, an incredible journey of upheaval and learning and wisdom. Like, for instance, I would give you an idea, okay, the word most commonly used today in today's IT or applications word is a word called the algorithm. Does anybody know where it comes from? There you are, one hand. Algorithm. It comes from it's a name of a man. Al-Khwarizmi. He wrote a book, Al-Jabr wa Al-Muqabla, the word algebra. It's restoration and balance. Al-Jabr wa Al-Muqabla, that's his book, on mathematics. And the word algorithm comes from him. His name is, when you translate his name into Latin, it becomes algorithm. And therefore the word algorithm, it emerges from there. Now the point I'm getting at, it's an age, a renaissance. And the renaissance is because it borrowed and accepted all civilizations and all knowledge from all over the world. Indian, Chinese, Persian, Mesopotamian, Syrian, Egyptian, Greek. And it flourished. Does anybody know the mathematics involved in the calligraphy that goes to see, if you take the Taj today, the calligraphy, the mathematics that an ayat has to finish over there, the mathematics, the precision that goes in. The precision that also goes into making of a great temple. All this is a journey that I read. It was in defense of a religion that had in its very soul the idea of inclusiveness and borrowing from and enriching itself. And it took off primarily because of that 9/11 attack in America, and you had those planes going to the World Trade Center and then whatever, the Pentagon, and you had this entire upheaval and this launch of the war on terror. And you question these words. What is terror, actually? We are questioning it now. Who defines terror? We need to know these words. And therefore, this book, The Monk, the Moa, and Moses Ben Jaloon, and it's 3 or 4 narratives running simultaneously. One story is about of the past, of the books of translation of mathematics and physics and light and music being translated from the Arabic into Latin and Hebrew, from Arabic and Hebrew into Latin and French. And those translations entering the world of Europe, the libraries of Europe, from Bologna to Paris to London, and in Italy, Sicily. If you go today to any university in Europe, Any. Go to the medieval section of the history department and check where the sources of any subject. Mathematics, history, astronomy, physics, chemistry, music, the source material is all Arabic, till today. Did you know that? 90% of the sources are Arabic. Where is the Arabic? It's come from India, it's come from China, it's come from Persia, it's come from Egypt, it's come from Greek knowledge. And there were translations that were done by the tomes, and the list of translators is incredible, the job that they did. It's all history being created, it's all there. Simultaneously is another narrative is a young Moroccan who's incredibly angry by this terminology, and he's taking on the world for this discovery, to talk about what's happening in our world today. He and his band of students of 4 from Berkeley University. That's the other narrative. And the third narrative is a young girl called Rehana. And Rehana is a little girl who's a student of a man called Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni was an incredible scholar, a kind of a polymath. And his relationship with this little girl, and is he teaching her science and history and philosophy, he's teaching her, and their relationship, and how she grows up, and till the day he dies. Now, who's Al-Biruni? Al-Biruni is the man, if you've read Amartya Sen, the argumentative Indian, he is the man who actually admonishes Aryabhat for his critique, admonishes Brahmagupta for his critique of Aryabhat. Brahmagupta admonishes the thesis, admonishes Aryabhat for his thesis on the eclipses, on the movement of the stars, and he calls Aryabhat a fake astronomer, primarily because his agenda is somewhere else. Now, Aryabhat is 5th century or 6th century AD, Brahmagupta is 7th century AD, and Al-Biruni is writing in the 11th century AD. He is criticizing a scholar of the 8th century who did a wrong critique of a scholar from the 5th century. Who's he writing to? But he's telling Brahmagupta, my friend, I think the reason why you're admonishing the scholar is because if what he says is true, your entire edifice on which you stand for will become shaky. Why does an eclipse occur? You have monsters eating the moon and monsters eating that, but Aryabhat says no, there's circulation of planets. And that's the reason why an eclipse occurs. If you agree with that theory, what happens to myth? What happens to myth then? What happens to mythology then? And that's the journey of Al-Biruni, who's teaching this young child. And these are the 3 journeys in the book. It's called The Monk, the Moor, and Moses Ben-Judah, and the transference of knowledge from east to west, and the making of Europe and the so-called Renaissance, because they actually call that 700 years in European history the Dark Ages. They actually called it the Dark Ages in Europe. The Dark Ages might have existed in Europe, but they weren't dark in the East. They weren't dark in the East. A lot of things were happening in the East, in China and India and Persia and Egypt, in Mesopotamia. So therefore, it is, like I said, a journey of knowledge and the making, and simultaneously the journey of these 4 young students today from Berkeley University and what they are discovering in this entire process. So that's.
And did you go into that book knowing full well what the history was, or did you yourself?
Thanks to my father. Thanks to my father, because there was a time when I was very young, he used to talk about these things. So when I saw this 9/11 tamasha occurring, I needed to journey now. because it is an attack, and it was not just a war on terror. It was called Islamic terror. And then I decided, let me give it a thought. What is it really all about? And not that the people behind those attacks were not, of course there were terrorist attacks, and they happened to be all Muslims, I think. Most of them perhaps were. But what I was getting at a larger picture behind that. And therefore this book, The Monk, the Moor, and Moses Ben Jelloun. Of course, the monk is a Cistercian monk of the 13th century. The Moor is, this is all happening in Spain, in Toledo, where the translations are occurring from Arabic and Hebrew into Latin. And then from there into the libraries of London, Paris, and Bologna, and elsewhere in Germany. So it's those translations that are occurring.
Do you think the narrative has moved on, globally speaking, from the point that you were writing the book at?
I think what's happened actually, Aakar, we've moved backwards. It doesn't matter. Fact does not matter. Fiction does. And it stays across the world. The fake news is the truth, accepted by and large, till a Julian Assange comes around to tell you something else, and then he's sent to jail for sedition. Because it's critically important for the power structures across the world not to accept and to rely on what is called, I think, what is called news or information with an agenda behind it, as opposed to information or fact. There is this slant of agenda behind it, and all regimes need it. For some strange reason, these peculiar power structures, they need it. What will happen if the truth comes out? Will they collapse? I don't know. What is their fear? What is their fear of an objective reality? But they're frightened.
So let's go to the third book now. It's more direct. It doesn't have a device as the first.
No device.
Why and what is it that you sought to say through that book that had been left unsaid in the first book?
It is like it was a journey of perhaps of rewriting objectively a history and having a dialogue with the reader, and hopefully presenting an alternative point of view about a world that we've inherited. Like I use this word when I ask a question as to this algorithm, where does it come from, you know? Also to puncture the bubble of European arrogance in terms of the East is superstitious and the West has the age of reason. We have a lot of superstition, and so do they. But we also have a lot of reason, and so do they. But simultaneously, their age of reason did not emerge out of their superstition. It emerged from those translations of philosophy, of Aristotle, of and Socrates, and Brahmagupta, and Aryabhat, and Al-Khwarizmi, and Al-Baruni, and Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd.
Sorry to hijack his. So there are two things. One is when we have Ruh Afza, which is something that is made on the subcontinent by this company called Hamdard, both in India and Pakistan. They use a formula devised 1,000 years ago by a man called Ibn Sina. It's the same sort of Greek medicine that the Arabs brought into the rest of Europe through a series of translations, but not only translations. There were real scientists amongst them
Oh,
who
absolutely.
took forward the Aristotelian way of thinking back and brought it back into a continental Europe that had lost it from it. That's why Dark Ages. But a lot of words, like classically words that start with AL, including alcohol, come to us from
No,
the
alchemy.
Arabs. Alchemy as well. At one point in time in the world, there are only 4 extant translations of Aristotle's logic. Everything that we know today in terms of modern science comes out of those 4 hand-translated works that were then brought into Arabic and then retranslated into...
And improved upon by Ibn Rushd.
Very
It wasn't just transliteration. It wasn't just transliteration. Interpretations also occurred in those books.
So I said we would have 15 minutes for questions, but I'm going to have to cut that to 10 because I need to ask you to speak to us about the crisis of the present. So we are looking at an India today which is in perhaps manifestly different in spirit on its street than it was 3 or 4 years ago. There is a sense of participation in resistance. There is a longevity to these protests. There is a sense of unity that is behind them. What is it that you think about what has been going on since the middle of December? And can you give us some sort of insight into what lies behind them?
You know, I believe that these protests ostensibly seem to be protests about the CAA and NPR and NCR. It seems ostensibly to be protests for or against these potential acts and disruptors. I think it's much more than that. I think what has gotten people engaged at one level, it is these 3 so-called, but at another level, it's also got to do with freedom of speech. It's got to do with silencing of dissent across the country. It's got to do with human rights abuses. It's got to do with guys being shoved into jail on spurious charges and then released 15 years later and saying they were innocent and destroying lives and families. And predominantly they happen to be Muslims. Predominantly or Dalits. It's a revolt that's occurred. Now, what shape and form it will take in the future, I'm not so sure. But right now, the thing is, students protesting against freedom of speech, etc., and now anti-CAA, and that ostensibly seems to be the reason. But below that, I believe there's far more than just that. And an anger which is built up over time of a series of events and things that have occurred both politically and economically.
2 very brief questions. Have you, in your lifetime, seen something like this before in our part of the world? And B, do you think that this has any sort of long-term ramifications for our society and our culture, if any?
No, I believe that this time we have a regime. All regimes, even earlier regimes, fundamentally had a very sad record in terms of human rights and abuses. True. But I think earlier regimes did allow a certain amount of freedoms of speech, and other kinds of freedoms were allowed, but by and large the state was also at times pretty repressive, like during the emergency. It was pretty tough to... But this regime, when it emerged, it's very clear, its manifestos are very clear. The first speech that our Prime Minister made in Parliament, as he entered Parliament, first thing that he said, he touched, knowing that the camera was there, he always knows where the camera is. He touched the stairs of Parliament, and then he climbed into this hall of, and then he says, after 1,000 years, reached power. In other words, including the 70 years pre his arrival into the parliament. It includes that. In other words, he's ushering in a new age. Nobody heard that? Did anyone? I have a very long memory about things said. He said that. No, not even Atal Bihari Vajpayee, his arrival on stage. It's a position taken. Very clear position taken, and therefore it's manifested. Simultaneously, we are aware of the works of the mentors of this organization. All you have got to do is read. Mr. Golwalkar or Mr. Savarkar and Hedgewar, and you just read them and you'll know. Right or wrong is separate, but it's a point of view that they have. You might determine it as right or you might determine it as wrong. That's left to you all. But it is a point of view and they represent that point of view. And that's the truth. You decide whether to oppose it or to accept it. I oppose it. And not because my name is Saeed Mirza. Right now my name is Aakar Patel, as I oppose it. And I'll tell you why. Because I believe in equality and freedom for all. That's it. No more, no less. No religion. I'm not interested in religion. Equality, freedom for all. And I oppose this philosophy on this very simple basis. I oppose. Until the day I die, I'll be opposing it. Simple. And don't bullshit me with CAA and NP. I'm not interested. I know exactly who you are. You have a lady in the parliament that you've selected and put into parliament who said that Nathuram Godse is a hero. Now, it's true. Another lady, another sadhu who's in that dress, etc., says the people who believe are Ramzades, those who don't are Haramzades. She's in parliament right now. You have a man who was actually Tadipar, who's your home minister today. Fact, these are objective truths. There are a lot of thugs in the other political parties also simultaneously. I have no, absolute, which is true. Thugs, murderers, rape, they're all there in all parties. But what I'm getting at is, what do I stand for? And therefore I will oppose. And it's far more manifest today, this entire approach towards, I think, inequities most regimes have not helped resolve. But you stand for it. You stand for equality. You stand for decency. You stand for freedom. You stand. And you'd oppose, And the future, Aakar, is very clear. It's very clear because it's taken 75 years for them to come into a position, and that's why he made that statement, Bhaiya, for 1,000 years. Those are little hiccups of the earlier regimes.
Do these protests signify something deeper and more meaningful?
Absolutely. It's going to. The point is, this is a manifestation of a start. It looks like it's going to spread. I think so, for a very simple reason. A lot of other forces are going to join in because there are other oppressions that have also occurred across the board. Other groups are going to come into play. From their perspective, it's going to happen.
I'm sorry to have cut into your time, but we'll take a couple of questions, and if you have a comment, please keep it very brief, and we'll take them all together, and then maybe if we have time, Saeed Mirza can then respond. I think I saw a hand here.
There's a hand there.
Lady here. Right here.
The question I had is basically, we talked about government, repression and oppression of a particular kind. I wanted to know what you thought particularly about the judiciary or institutions of the judiciary, institutions that are sort of, in place to have checks and balances. Like, I was watching Mohan Joshi Hazar Ho yesterday, and you talked about Tamasha the other day when you talked about the courts. I feel like that's what's happening right now. Like, there is an erosion of legitimacy of the courts themselves, because one, like a simple sexual harassment case cannot be solved by the Supreme Court. Or even like you have judges saying very political statements about the people in power. My question is, when that happens and there are people out on the streets protesting, in some ways this is extra institutional, right? Like, we are sort of outside the system. What is the way forward, or how do you progress from that?
Can you just hold on to that? We'll take a couple more and then you can all put them. So one is on judiciary. Somebody else have a question? Was there a hand there? There's one here as well, right? Is there somebody this side who wants to ask a question?
A quick question.
Oh, it's here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
So, across the world, it's not only in India, across the world, we see that the Islam of philosophy being taken out by the Islam of politics, the Hinduism of the philosophy of Hinduism being overtaken by Hindutva forces, and this is happening at the same time across the world. What is the force that is making it global? I mean, what's making it global?
So we take, please like hold on to that. We'll take one. I think there's a gentleman there in the fifth row. So one is the judiciary, one is religion and politics.
Hi, could you briefly talk about your work for television? Because I just want to know what the difference is for you working for television opposed to films and writing. I mean, because Nukkad is a childhood favorite, so.
okay.
Thanks.
Any other question?
Why don't you take these three and then we'll see if we
I'll
have
take the first one from television. I'll come to that a little later because that's more, I use any platform that I get to express, to have a dialogue with an audience. Any platform that I can get, and whether it's television, I did a lot of work on television, a lot of documentaries and television serials. For those who are above the age of 50, we made some pretty popular television serials, one was like Nukkad, and there was Intizar and what. And it gave us pleasure, and there was a difference, primarily because the time frame, the idea of the episodic frame that you have of 23 minutes as opposed to a film or a documentary, when you have a time imposed to create and conclude, because that's what we wanted to do, to conclude each episode by itself. So when you have a time barrier, like a straitjacket, to create and then to end, the kind of structuring that you do for that 23 minutes is completely different as opposed to a film where you have more time to elaborate and to meander and arrive at. So that's a fundamental difference that you have with, say, television, writing and making, as opposed to the construction form of film and television. Have I answered your question? Fundamentally, that's otherwise you can do a lot of other things, but fundamentally this is the difference. Coming back to your question about
religion and politics.
Yeah, religion and politics. I believe, this is my take, you don't have to, subscribe to it, but my take is, I think it stems from one fundamental truth across the world. Economic instability. Where people feel, by and large, the ordinary citizen feels he or she has lost control over his or her destiny, to lose control of. It can be manifested in all kinds of shapes and forms: religious, communal, ethnic, racial. We have inherited an economic and political system that cannot guarantee us anything. We used to believe that education is the path to whatever. It's no longer true. It's no longer true across the world, and much more so in India. So what happens with the idea of education? The biggest employer today in the country, besides the railway, I think they've even beaten the railways now, are guards and chowkidars in the so-called upper middle class and upper middle class housing colonies. Those boys who are your guards, security guards, the liftmen, the chap at the door who opened the gate for you as a car. The biggest employer today in India, across the country, when the middle class is gating itself to protect itself from the masses, they employ guards, chowkidars. And that's the biggest employer. And if you go and ask these boys where they're from and where they've studied, most of them have studied till the 12th. Most of them, some 12 plus 2. Check. Go to your next gated colony and find out who these boys were. And it's incredible. This is what's happened. And they know their truth. They know education does not pay. So they've taken a recourse. We still believe on the PhD and let's do a master's and we'll do that. And just check. How many of them get jobs anyway? They've understood something very simple. आगे पढ़ने से कोई फायदा नहीं है. ये कर लो, नौकरी तो मिल जाएगी. And the other groups, the disenfranchised, वो हाथों में हुनर. They've reached into what is called the unorganized sector of work. Dhabas, mechanics, plumbers, they moved over there. And they know something very, because it does not pay to go further than that. They have to live, run families, pay bills, send their kids to school. This is a solution. Fundamentally, I think it is an economic and political system which gets manifested. It's so easy to divert attention from this into religious, communal, linguistic, racial.
Thanks. Can you just move to the last question, please?
And the last,
judiciary and what she and the rest of us can do about it. Your comments.
I tell you, the thing is that that's one of the reasons. That's the other assaults, the other protests that are joining in. The assaults on the judiciary that are taking place. The infiltration of the compromising of the judicial system, and you know exactly who is benefiting how. It means a complete overhauling of this system. Today, from what was it today's paper when you had a justice, one of the justices, Mishra, was a glorious genius, the genius behind. That's the point I'm getting at. No, the servility is in our blood. It's not just this half-wit. It's in our blood. We are, the people below us, we thrash. Guys above us, we genuflect. It's strange what we become. Anyone below us will kick, crush, humiliate. Above us, we'll start jhukka denge. Coming back to how do you fight this? The only way is to get lawyers, concerned citizens together to protest about the state of affairs, because the net result is the last recourse to justice is the other courts. What is going to happen if that is compromised? And then finally, actually all said and done, I will survive, you will survive. Who's going to be hit? The poor, the disenfranchised. 70% of our population. They're going to be hit. And we don't give a damn. By the way, I also happen to, I'm plugging a workshop. I happen to be a member of an organization called the Sambhavna Institute for Public Policy and Politics. I happen to be part of that now for the next year. And we're doing a workshop on creating activists and lawyers to fight this assault on the judiciary, and also to fight for legal protection, provide legal aid to innocent people shoved under the acts of sedition. By the thousands. By the thousands, did you know that? It's not what you get on the papers. They are there by the thousands across the country, yeah? And they happen to be young students who so they need legal help. So how do we get that to them? That's the only way, I think, But there are also lawyers' organizations like Indra Jaising and Vrinda Grover and who else? Lots of the Prashant Bhushan. By the way, this institute is run by the Prashant Bhushan Trust that I'm part of now. So I'm there for the next till the end of this year, and then I quit. I get back to my writing, but I volunteered to help out over here. So is that an answer? I don't quite know, but that's all I can say. It has to be fought.
No, I think a protest is the way forward. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we ran 5 or 7 minutes overtime. Thank you for coming on a Sunday. Saeed Mirza, director, filmmaker, writer, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed Mirza.
Thank you,
Aakar Patel.
Very good.
I know we could have continued on, but the tyranny of time.